Welcome back to International Star Media, the gold star standard, at the gold star standard. Reactions, reviews, and news you can use. Once again, I am your host, International Yada, for the records and the dollars. And check this out. Found guilty of human trafficking. Found guilty of violation of the Travel Act. We're going to get into this story and also go into a brief of the Travel Act, what it is, and why you don't want to get caught up in this. We've been telling you time and time again, this is serious business. Human trafficking / sex trafficking. But let's get straight off into this. Here we go. Tyler, Texas. A Jefferson man has been found guilty of federal sex trafficking violations in the Eastern District of Texas, announced acting U.S. Attorney Abe McLaughlin Jr. Found guilty. This serious business. Corey Lamar Johnson, 42, right here, was found guilty by a jury of all counts following a 6-day trial before the U.S. District Judge J. Campbell Barker on May 19th, 2025. Specifically, the jury convicted Johnson of 2 counts of sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, obstruction of a sex trafficking investigation, 3 counts of interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, and conspiracy to violate the Travel Act. And like I said before, we will get off into the Travel Act. Johnson's co-defendants, Jessica Smith and Rachel Walker, previously pleaded guilty to related charges. The defendants used violence and threats of violence to compel his victims to engage in commercial sex for his profit. We need y'all to take heed to this story so you don't end up like him. Force, fraud, coercion, violence, or the threats of violence. You see that? Those are the elements. We keep going over these elements time and time again, and we will continue to. I'm going to take this from the top, though. The defendant used violence and threats of violence to compel his victims to engage in commercial sex for his profit, said Assistant Attorney General Harmet K. Dillon of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. There is no place in a civilized society for the defendant's inhumane conduct, and the Justice Department is committed to punishing human trafficking and achieving justice for its victims. On June 15, 2023, Johnson and 2 co-conspirators were named in an indictment returned by a federal grand jury, charging them with sex trafficking, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate the Travel Act. It's serious business here. They would throw you away for this. At sentencing, Johnson faces a minimum sentence of 15 years and a maximum sentence of life in federal prison, as well as mandatory restitution. So he was just found guilty, and the minimum that he will receive in federal prison is 15 years, and the maximum is life. 15 years to life. Don't throw your life away. Take heed Everything is not for everybody. Find something legal to do. The statutory sentence prescribed by Congress is provided here for informational purposes, as the sentencing will be determined by the court based on the advisory sentencing guidelines and other statutory factors. A sentencing hearing will be scheduled after the completion of a pre-sentence investigation by the U.S. probation officer. And here's a news story on this. Get this picture off of here. Bear with me. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go.
A Jefferson man found guilty of sex trafficking in a federal courtroom in Tyler just earlier today. Now, a jury found Corey Lamar Johnson, 42 years old, guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, obstruction of sex trafficking investigation, 3 counts of interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, and conspiracy to violate the Travel Act. I'm going to pull up his image now so you can see it. Here you go. Prosecutors say that the victims were found in prostitution, which occurred at hotels and motels in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, New York, and California. Now, the state showed receipts of hotel room bookings in his name, including a stay here in Tyler in 2020.
Y'all hear that? Part of what they used to find him guilty is hotel rooms that he had booked in his name. That was part of it. Also, postings that he posted for the purposes of prostitution. You better know what you're getting into. You better know what's going on out here. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's what they're going to tell you. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. You should do your best to learn the law, to learn what's going on before you make the wrong decision and they lock you up for a minimum of 15 years in prison and a maximum of life. Let's go.
Louisiana, Tennessee, New York, and California. Now, the state showed receipts of hotel room bookings in his name, including a stay here in Tyler in 2020. Now, threats of violence were also used against the victims by Johnson.
Threats of violence were also used against the victims by Johnson. That's what she just read. There was also a factor in finding him guilty. Let's go.
In California.
Matter of fact, we're going to take this from the top and let it play all the way through. Let's go. Pay attention.
Found guilty of sex trafficking in a federal courtroom in Tyler just earlier today. Now, a jury found Corey Lamar Johnson, 42 years old, guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, obstruction of sex trafficking investigation, 3 counts of interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, and conspiracy to violate the Travel Act. I'm going to pull up his image now so you can see it. Here you go. Prosecutors say that the victims were found in prostitution, which occurred at hotels and motels in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, New York, and California. Now, the state showed receipts of hotel room bookings in his name, including a stay here in Tyler in 2020. Now, threats of violence were also used against the victims by Johnson. That's according to officials, and at least 2 of his victims testified in court. Now, according to a statement released by the U.S. Attorney's Office, evidence presented at the trial showed that Johnson trafficked young women across the United States and compelled them to engage in commercial sex through force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion. Johnson recruited vulnerable young women through social media posts that boasted of his lavish lifestyle. He promised.
I know I said I was going to let this play through, but I really need to drive this point home. Force, fraud, coercion, violence, and or threats of violence could get you a sentence of 15 to life in prison. Take heed to these stories Learn from the mistakes of others and pay attention.
Them to engage in commercial sex through force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion. Johnson recruited vulnerable young women through social media posts that boasted of his lavish lifestyle. He promised the victims he would that he recruited that they could also achieve such a lifestyle if they were to join him. Once they were recruited, Johnson introduced the victims to commercial sex, and then when the victims wanted to leave him, he would become violent, using force and threats and brandishing firearms and bragging about having beat a murder charge. All of this to keep the victims engaged in commercial sex for his profit. That's according to the statement, again, that they released. Now, the maximum sentence Johnson could face is a minimum of 15 years and a maximum sentence of life in prison, as well as mandatory restitution. The sentencing has not yet been decided and will be determined by the court based on the advisory sentencing guidelines and the other statutory factors. The statement said that a sentencing hearing will be scheduled after the completion of a pre-sentence investigation by the U.S. Probation Office.
Y'all heard that right? Force, fraud, coercion, violence, and or threats of violence. Making promises to upgrade her lifestyle. Yeah, they'll use that against you. Call that coercion.
What?
Pay attention and remember that ignorance of the law is no excuse for not knowing the law. Okay? Ignorance of the law is no excuse for not knowing the law. Everything ain't for everybody. Okay, check this out. The Travel Act. This is what the Travel Act is. Title 18, U.S. Code, subsection 1952, the Travel Act. Remember I told you when you see this symbol right here, that means subsection when it comes to law. A lot of people see this and don't know what it means. It means subsection, meaning they have different sections of the law. And this is the section that they're using for the Travel Act. It's Title 18 U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is Title 18. The subsection of the law is 1952. And it also will maybe break down to 1952A, 1952B, or similar to that. But y'all pay attention. Get you a Black's Law Dictionary also if you don't have one. That breaks down a lot of the legal terms where they use legalese in law. That's the language of the law. It's called legalese. And a Black's Law Dictionary will help out a lot with defining words and terms when it comes to law. But anyways, let's get back to this. Title 18 U.S. Code, subsection 1952, the Travel Act. Under Title 18 U.S. Code 1952, it is a federal crime to use the United States mail to engage in interstate or international travel for the purpose of furthering certain unlawful activities. This law, colloquially referred to as the Travel Act, a conviction of a crime under this law could result in up to 5 years in federal prison. And if violence is involved, the sentence could go up to 20 years or even life in prison. So the maximum of violation of the Travel Act, if violence is involved, is 20 years or life in prison. Minimum 5. You paying attention? Okay, let's go. The Travel Act was initially intended to give the federal government a tool to fight organized crime, For example, suppose a crime boss lived in one state but conducted illegal criminal enterprise in another. In that case, it was thought neither state would have legal jurisdiction to prosecute the case. The Travel Act has been used in different ways, including in conjunction with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, or the RICO. Y'all following along, right? 18 USC 1952 says, A. This is what I was telling you about with the letters. This is a subsection to 1952. A. Whoever travels in interstate or foreign commerce to use the mail for any facility in interstate or foreign commerce with intent to distribute the proceeds of any unlawful activity, or 2, commit any crime of violence to further any unlawful activity, or 3, otherwise promote, manage, establish, carry on, or facilitate the promotion, management, establishment, or carrying on of any unlawful activity. So they saying his unlawful activity, Johnson, we talking about, the guy that they just found guilty, was human trafficking. And he also used violence to further any unlawful activity, which could also get him 20 years in prison, along with the 20 years or along with the life sentence that human trafficking charge carries. But let's continue. For purposes of the Travel Act, unlawful activity is any business enterprise involving gambling, liquor, narcotics, or controlled substances, prostitution offenses, extortion, money laundering, bribery, or arson, violating state or federal law. Prostitution, right there. That's how they got him with the this Travel Act. A lot of you never heard of the Travel Act. This is serious business out here. If you get labeled as a human trafficker, you don't want to get labeled at this. Force, fraud, coercion, violence, and or the threats of violence could get you a life sentence in prison, up to a life sentence in prison, minimum of 15 years. You better know what you're doing out there. It's no joke. International Star Media, the Gold Star Standard, at the Gold Star Standard. Reactions, reviews, and news you can use. Once again, I am your host, International Yada, for the records and the dollars. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share the videos. I really appreciate it. And we will see you on the next one.